employing 1,600 high-value highly skilled engineers, generating something like £180 million GVA per annum to the Welsh and UK economy. We have quantum encryption expertise funded through Innovate UK's programs. We have world-leading providers of optical transceivers for fibre communications, and we have backhaul capability. So
what interventions would support them?
So for interventions, what I would suggest, the Advanced Propulsion Centre is a really good model to look at. It's in a different sector. The Advanced Propulsion Centre is funded through the Department for Business, Energy and Industrial Strategy, and its remit is to help transition the automotive industry from petrol and diesel engines into electric drivetrains using batteries. Have a look at that as a model. It is an incredibly good model for transitioning an entire industry from one technology to another technology. It brings together supply chains. It's very, very effective. So that's one of the interventions I would suggest. Other interventions, I think, could be cyber certification, and also just helping UK companies get access onto some of the standards bodies would be a very effective. We've got lots of SMEs.
Great, thank you very much.
No worries.
Hiba.
Thank you very much for your question. Regarding the hardware, we, as a company, and to be honest, as in the UK, as a nation, we don't have very essential foundries. We can design the silicon, we can prototype them, we can work on from the beginning how actually it would work, but the actual manufacturing of the chip, not the hardware, that one chip, which is it's like the CPU or a piece of DSP, those actually, they require very high intensive foundries, which is, if we want to build them in the UK, it will cost around £10 billion today, probably over that number, and Andy can correct me on that. And there is something which is in the Far East, they have actually unlimited resources in something of a state aid rule. And Europe, last few years, they bypassed something for state aid rule called IPCEI, which is Important Project of Common European Interest. So Germany were able to fund 1.2 billion from their money to support these foundries. France, they put in 0.8 billion. Holland, they put 0.4 billion. So that amount in the UK last a few years in terms of building these foundries, we haven't actually, the UK hasn't supported that type of manufacturing. So in the chip manufacturing, we don't, but however, on the hardware scale, we are able. And the way we see it, we build the hardware, we build the software, but the actual component and the chips, that today we don't have the capabilities in the UK to actually manufacture that. Of course, I would like to be...
I'm really sorry to do this to you, but I think I better interrupt and go to the Minister, or we'll run out of time completely.
Thank you, Mr. McCabe, and thank you to all the witnesses. In particular, thank you to Dr. Sillars for your map of UK brilliance, which I think is really appreciated. In short, given that we've got 4 minutes, we've got £250 million of this diversification funding to spend over the next 3 years or so. My question to you three is simply, how would you spend it?
Would you like to go first?
Yes, 30 seconds each, 250 million quid.
30 seconds to spend 250 million. Okay, so I would prioritise the funding in terms of where the vulnerabilities are in the network, in terms of the ability of the UK to fulfil those vulnerabilities, and in terms of what markets it would open up. So there are specific parts in the telecom stack which are going to like to be more vulnerable than others, where the UK has prime capability and where we could then develop an export opportunity. And some of those, I can provide some sort of more detailed answers in writing if that's helpful.
Please.
My 30 seconds, I would spend it in basic research, cementing the intellectual property position of the UK. Pure and simple.
I would agree with Dr. Sala. So with Andy, we need to increase the amount of spending around the vulnerability and strengthening these networks. One other point, which is I would spend it on in areas outside UK, so it would generate more jobs around the north. Thank you.
I think you had something outstanding. You've got just about a minute and a bit to do it.
Well, it was the question to Dr. Johnson with regard to Open RAN maturity as an IP.
So the 45-second answer. So Mavenir is using IP access GSM 3G technology in its Open RAN development. So I support. Pradeep, I think, said that it would be ready within 12 months, and I agree with that. That's true statement.
Okay.
So that was it.
Great.
Did you have anything else, Minister?
Not that we can do in 90 seconds.
Okay, in that case, look, I'm very sorry to have had to hurry you a bit there, but we're trying to get through quite a lot this afternoon. Can I just thank all our witnesses for your evidence and the extra bits that you said you would possibly forward to us? That would be much appreciated. Thank you on behalf of the committee. That brings this session to a close. And I think if people are happy, we'll move on immediately excuse me, to the fifth panel of witnesses. I think we got them all. Yeah, we're going to hear now from Helen Duncan, who's the Managing Director of MWE Media. Mike Fake, have I pronounced your name correctly?
You haven't. It's Mike Fake.
It is fake. I apologise.
Fake, as in genuine. Yeah.
Yeah, I've got it now. Well, that's very kind of you to clear it up for me. Mike Fake, director and co-founder of Luminicity, and Dr. David Cleveley, who's CBE, who's an independent investor in several telecommunications companies. We've got until 3:30 for this session. Could we start with Helen Duncan? Could I ask you just to introduce yourself for the record?
Yes, I'm a consultant and freelance journalist specialising in RF technology and the wireless sector. I've been writing about this industry for the past 30 years. Prior to that, I was actually a practicing engineer in the high-frequency electronics industry.
Thank you. And Mr. Fake.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Hello, everybody, and thank you for giving me the opportunity to give evidence at the committee today. I'm director and co-founder of Luminicity, and I spent the last 30 years in Telecoms fibre optic components. So Luminicity is a spin-out from the University of Southampton, and we've developed a new fibre optic cable technology in which data travels 50% faster than in conventional cable, which will digitally shrink the UK, provide a more responsive internet, increase the physical separation of data centres, moving them out of big conurbations, and potentially reduces the cost of deploying 5G. So we're building a company to engineer telecom solutions and innovatively scale up the manufacturing base in the UK. So our opening statement is that we support the principles of the Telecom Security Bill. We see the diversification strategy as critical for successful execution. It's a real opportunity, actually, to build a secure UK leading network, fostering new entrants and technologies in the UK telecom supply chain, and to leverage innovative solutions for manufacturing scale in the UK. A challenge for SMEs, which I'd like to highlight, is ensuring sufficient scale-up investment. This is an expensive step and difficult to raise this level of capital independently, so we need a combination of public and private funding. And Luminicity is part of an overall ecosystem to improve the UK competitive position in a growing next generation economy. And in summary, we'd like to see this as an opportunity for a positive change rather than a retrospective solution to a singular problem.
Thank you. And Dr. Cleveley.
Thank you, Chairman. Well, my name is David Cleveley. As you pointed out, I've invested in a number of telecoms companies and sold a few of them successfully. I've been advisor to government, to Ofcom. I helped with, I was one of the experts who helped with the Communications Act in 2003. And to make sure I've got full disclosure, I was on one of the boards of the MOD for 8 years, looking after our ICT for all of defence in theatre and the back office.
Thank you very much.
And I have, if I may make 3 points very briefly, Mr. Chairman. Very briefly. Firstly, I'd like us to perhaps explore outside of this committee a little bit more about the edge cases for what constitutes a telecommunications network. Whilst the clauses in the 2003 Act 125 to 128 or so cover quite a lot of things which are extended in this Act, I think we need to think rather more carefully, perhaps, about what actually is a telecommunications network in a world where many of these things are distributed both in hardware and in software. The second point I'd like to make is about the spending on R&D and procurement. I'm sure we'll get onto this, but I think that we need to solve a problem which is deep-seated in the UK economy about the difficulty of translating between R&D and actually deploying it into real practice. And I've got some further comments I can make on that. And finally, I do note that in the previous session last week, Miriam Cates picked up on one of the contributors saying we couldn't forecast 20 years into the future, and Alex Towers asked about a contested story to do with Huawei back in 2005. And I'd just like to point out that I had a small part in all of that, and I can verify indeed that was discussed. I won't go into the details, as you'll probably imagine I wouldn't. But one of the things that I participated in then was the Foresight Cyber Trust and Crime Foresight Commission. And a lot of the things that we're talking about today were indeed forecast 20 years ago. And I think that there are some lessons which we can explore later in the committee, if you wish to do so, from that experience.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much. Okay, and the first question from James Sunderland.
Thank you for the opportunity of asking the first question. Welcome this afternoon. Thank you for giving us your time. I note from the biographical notes that all three of you have got clear commercial background with what appears to be British-owned firms. I'm very pro-British myself, as you'd expect as a British MP. So could I please ask for your opinion on the extent to which the Telecoms Bill will offer opportunities for British firms?
Okay, shall I go first? So I think the diversification strategy is really important, and it's really great to see the National Telecom Centre proposal and the £250 million for R&D. But I guess one concern that we do have is actually, is this going to be enough? If you have a look at, listen to earlier parts of the hearing last week, BT was saying they invest £500 million per annum. Huawei has got a revenue of probably $120 million per year. And what do they actually invest in R&D? Maybe did I say million? I meant billion. They probably invest $2 billion a year in R&D. So the opportunity I see is that, we have a short-term focus for network equipment manufacturers to replace high-risk vendor equipment. But in that period, it's going to be difficult for other new entrants to actually get the share of their mind. But the opportunity is, to foster new entrants and technologies in the UK telecom supply chain and leverage innovative solutions for manufacturing scale in the UK. I think the other thing just to say is that there's a lot of focus on the radio access part of the 5G, but actually that's only one very small part of the network. And there's optical fiber connectivity from the masts, and transport to the core of the network. And that's critical to the security and the performance of the network also.
I go next.
Please.
When I started my career, the industry was dominated by big names like STC, Plessey, GEC, Raycol. And they all received funding from the defence organisations like RSRE at Malvern and so on. And they used a lot of the spin-offs from that technology to develop their telecoms capability. That all ceased in the 1990s after the Berlin Wall came down, etc., and cost plus was abolished. And I think it's quite significant that that the independent industry research shrunk in those times, and we are now at last seeing a little bit of stimulation going back into British industry thanks to the catapults like Andy Sellers, and I think this could be an opportunity, if not to return to those days, but to actually put some investment in and to develop the talents that we do have in this country.
Thank you. And Dr. Cleveland.
Yeah, well, I think this bill is a great opportunity, as the other speakers have said. I would say, in technical jargon, it's a necessary but not sufficient condition. I think that it does provide some great opportunities. I'm an investor and created a number of British companies, of which I too, like you, are very proud. And I feel that we do need, however, to think very carefully about how the market actually works. And a number of speakers before us have talked about the way in which the number of suppliers has come down in this business. And I think that we need to be very careful in thinking about how we intervene to set the rules of the game and to encourage certain kinds of behaviors. It's, let's take one example of which I'm very, very familiar, not only with government, but also large corporates, the notion that you go through a procurement department that is forcing you down on price, and it doesn't have as part of their KPIs, their key performance indicators, the notion of innovation. And the notion of innovation, on the other hand, is built into a lot of the systems that are employed in other countries, primarily the United States, as a way of evaluating whether a technology should be procured or not. And I think we need to think rather more carefully about how we foster that development and growth of smaller companies and into larger companies, particularly with this view about innovation. For example, Ofcom is an economic regulator, one of, I think, 11 or so economic regulators in the UK. It has always, below the radar, treated innovation as one of the things that it ought to be fostering. I would suggest, for example, that alongside this consideration, this bill, we think about how we push innovation rather more firmly and put some money behind it in terms of procurement.
Dean Russell.
I'd like to understand what the impact would be of bringing forward the deadline of the 2027 deadline with regards many of these measures. If I could ask Mike in the first instance, please.
Thank you. Yes. Obviously, we've got two things to do here because we need to replace out the existing vendors' equipment. But in parallel, if we can invest in the UK supply chain, and I mean, we have a very healthy supply chain in the sense that there's a lot of companies which provide optical components and subsystems into the equipment manufacturers. And if we can basically, what we need to do is do both things at once. Okay, so we need to swap out the equipment, but also we need to invest in the new companies coming up, so that in the future we can have a much more future-proof, innovative, secure, and leading network. So pushing the timescales forward, I think we just have to recognise that in the short term we're going to be stuck with two alternative vendors that we need to swap out. But if we can invest in the up-and-coming, innovative, small SMEs and really foster those, as the previous speakers have said, then I think we've got a real opportunity to change things and to actually have a world-leading British high UK content network moving forward.
Thank you. Could I ask Helen the same question, please?
Yeah, I think there are some real practical difficulties in swapping out the equipment. It sounds simple, you just take one radio out and put another one in, but I think you'd find that cell sites would be down and consumers would be complaining. There's been some research recently by a company, albeit funded by Huawei, called Assembly Research, which estimates that it'll put the UK 3 years behind in its programme of 5G deployment. And at a time when communications are obviously key to us surviving the unusual circumstances of the pandemic, it seems counterintuitive to think about putting even more strain on that by moving the deadline closer. So I think perhaps it should be the actual installation engineers who work for the networks that you should be asking this question to. How much disruption is it going to cause? Thank you. And to David too, please.
Yeah, I'd like to echo what Helen just said, but in a rather different way. There's an engineering problem here, which is, I think, what we've been dealing with. But there's also a human behavioral problem. Anybody who's worked in a large corporation or worked in these large projects will know that the way that people approach a problem and the way they think about it, the way they want to program it and the urgency they feel is driven a lot by, as much by the psychological issues as it is by the technical. And I would urge you to think through how you would encourage the behavior that you want to see. Now, obviously, government can do that by simply issuing an edict or whatever and forcing a deadline. But there may be other ways in which you can get more innovation and a more rapid shift than the 2027 deadline, simply by thinking through with the industry and going back to Helen's point about the engineers actually on the ground about what is actually required. And I think a little bit more detailed thinking on that could yield some very, very positive results.
Thank you. Kevin Jules, can I just follow up on Dean's point in terms of the actual date? 2027 is the date that's been set, and clearly the equipment that's going to go in is basically two vendors, Ericsson and Nokia. And I think it was you, Mike, who said earlier on that there's opportunities for UK diversification. I mean, what's going to drive that? Because if you've got operators who've put brand new equipment in the lead up to 2027, what's going to be the incentives for those companies to look at alternatives to that?
Yeah, I mean, that's... Sorry. Yeah. David, do you want to go first?
No, Mike, please go ahead and I'll come in.
Okay. So I was going to say, I mean, that's a difficult problem to solve. But I think that it's important that, innovation is a very powerful force. And, you can turn around things in this new world very, very quickly. Yeah. And basically, although you'll have old legacy systems and you replace everything from overseas vendors with old legacy systems, you need to keep moving forward. And if you invest in our, innovative, basically, in terms of optics, we've probably got one of the world's leading telecom fiber optics innovation capability in the whole world in terms of the universities. We've got a whole bunch of SMEs out there. And what they're struggling to do is actually make that step to some scale and to get that innovation deployed in the network.
Not to cut across you, but can I just say that I accept all that. But if from the operator's point of view, you've just invested a lot of capital in, ripping out equipment and putting new equipment in up till 2027. What's the incentive then going to be for those operators necessarily to look at new technologies around that?
Could I just say, I don't think it's necessarily the case that they're just going to use Ericsson and Nokia equipment. Vodafone, for instance, has committed to equipping something like 2,500 cell sites with Open RAN equipment. So they are taking a forward-looking view and trying to stimulate that themselves.
If I may intervene here as well, I mean, it's curious, isn't it? There's this, the economists will tell you that sunk costs are sunk costs and you should always move forward. And I think that's something to hold on to. Human nature says, well, we've invested in this, let's see if we can sweat that asset to make the most of it. You know, and a constructive dialogue with your finance director, chief financial officer, is always an essential part of all of this. And understanding, for example, the risk that a company is running and its weighted average cost of capital, its cost of borrowing on the market, are all very important things to understand what is driving them. But essentially, it's this. If you can get more business and you can improve your service, get more customers, make more money as a result of doing investment, then that's what you're going to do. And I think that that's the key. The key point here is, can we find a way of making it clear and very straightforward to the most truculent of finance directors, chief financial officers, that actually this is a very good investment for the future. And I think in there lies the key, because you need to get the incentives right.
Anyone else to this side? Okay, I think we'll go to Tianwar then.
Thank you very much, and thank you so much to welcome to all of you, and thank you so much for joining us. And if I can actually just say, particularly to Helen Duncan, and I should have mentioned this earlier when we had Heba Bevan, it's great to have two other female electrical engineers giving evidence to the committee, and I hope that we have many more such qualified representatives of the technology sector in committees in the future. And I want to, we've talked a little bit about how we got here, and Helen, you worked for Marconi, I worked for Northern Telecom, who bought STC, which was one of our last UK companies providing telecoms equipment. And I think without putting words into your mouth, it can be characterised by a lack of investment in innovation, a lack of investment in British sovereign, if you like, capability. And now that we're seeking, if you like, I think, seeking to reverse that, or sort of to jump ahead of that, what aspects, what interventions could best guarantee the long-term security and resilience of the UK telecoms network with UK sovereign capability supporting it? And is the £250 million diversification strategy set to achieve that? And can you give examples, and really looking for quite concrete examples about what you might add or change? And David, you talked about needing to give the incentives to the mobile operators. The Telecom Security Supply Chain Review was quite clear that there isn't an incentive right now in the supply chain to deliver security in mobile networks. So let's what interventions, what incentives?
Right. Well, starting from how we got into this situation, in the 1990s, we actually had three incumbent base station manufacturing companies in the UK. That was Orbitel in Nottinghamshire and Motorola and Lucent Technologies that were both in Swindon. And these survived for different lengths of time. Orbitel closed down in 1996 when Ericsson took over. Motorola ceased base station manufacturing for 2002, but stayed open, was then sold to Nokia. And Lucent became Alcatel-Lucent and was closed down. So mergers and acquisitions have clearly played a huge part, as did the dot-com bubble. And and as I mentioned, the removal of funding from the defence sector. Heba made the point that to support semiconductor manufacture in the UK, the 250 million would not even start to scratch the surface of that. So I think what we need to concentrate on is a little bit further up the food chain. We do have some very good capability in this country in subsystem component and subsystem manufacture based around the chips. We have some good design capability for chips that are then manufactured in the larger foundries elsewhere in the world. So supporting all those activities, the design and the manufacture of components and subsystems would give us a good basis and improve resilience. I'd also want to mention that we have some capability in this country in the test sector, test and measurement, and that's Spirent Communications and the RV Systems, albeit an American-owned company. They do manufacture RF and wireless test equipment in the UK. And by definition, test is ahead of the curve on development, that if you can make equipment to test something, you can actually make that equipment, because it's much more complicated to make test equipment than it is to make the base station or the handset itself. So I think those companies deserve our support as well. That was a very long question, Chi. I'm not sure if I understood every aspect that you were asking.
Oh, that's great. That's great. David.
Thanks, Chi. Nice to see you. I think one of the things that has been mentioned before in the session a little bit earlier is about standards, and I think that one of the things that changed telecommunications between the 1970s and through the dot-com revolution was the emergence of some of these more open standards like TCP/IP for running the internet and so on, and HTML for doing the web browsers. And I think that we could be putting a lot more money into a lot more effort into defining some of those standards, because if you define the interfaces for pieces of equipment correctly, then you can allow people to come in and provide bits of equipment that can conform to those interfaces. So that's one very concrete thing. You're quite right to say, up until relatively recently, the penalties on security and so on, the consequences have been very small. But in terms of behavior, you need both carrot and stick on things like this. You need to have something which will give the telecom operators a real reason to do something, whether that's as simple as a kite mark that simply says, your telecoms network you are using has been certified as secure, is may or may not be the kind of thing that would engender the behavior change, but noticeable with a number of things like Telegraph and WhatsApp. That is something which is seen to be quite an important thing. And finally, I think the networks of people are important in all of this. I noticed the government has spent some money on the 5G network, the networking across the UK, which is being run by Cambridge Wireless, which I was very proud to have helped set up. I think that this networking of people across the UK and between regions in particular. So we talked about the cluster of, in the previous session, about the cluster of people down in Bristol working on semiconductors and so on. I think the government should be putting some money into networking people together to have ways in which we can be exchanging ideas and getting to understand what each other is doing. We complain about silos in government and silos in corporate. We have silos across every single component of this industry. And it's no good to sit in, a part of the West Midlands or in Cambridge or in Belfast and not talk to other people about the issues and the standards and the technology. And whilst we seem to think that that gets delivered by the free market, in reality, that's not what is happening. And I think the government needs to intervene in particular to connect up all these people. I launched today for the Royal Academy of Engineering, the Northern Ireland Engineering Hub. I'm chair of the Enterprise Committee. And that was specifically picking Northern Ireland in order, because of its deep engineering history, to start to connect it with a lot of the other things that are happening in the rest of the United Kingdom. I think we need more of that. And I think out of that will come the same blossoming of innovation and engineering flowering that we've seen previously when people have been connected up together. I'm a great optimist on that.
Great, thanks very much.
Anything else?
I mean, if I can just add, there's the radio part of this network is very important, but also there's a fibre optic network which connects that back to the core. And I think if we can invest in innovation, so that's investing in the people that are coming up with the ideas at the universities, etc., invest in the SMEs, maybe smart ways in which we can, get to scale manufacturing in clever ways. And it's not just, for radios, but also potentially, hardware boxes, looking at gateways, etc., and also optical fiber, for instance, as well. I support wholeheartedly what the other two candidates have said, and especially the point on open standards that David made.
Thank you. I'm just going to go to the Minister, and the first time I'll come back. Minister.
Thank you, and thank you for the evidence you've given so far. It seems to me over the course of a lot of the evidence that we've heard over the last several sessions that there's a lot of consensus on standards being hugely important. There's a lot of consensus on building on clusters, both in terms of existing businesses, but also in the networks that David was talking about just now. I wonder, sort of, if you look into the sort of short and medium term, what are the immediate interventions that you would be making, rather than those sort of longer term, these are the things that we would like to be building up in the next few years? Should we start with David?
Thank you, Minister. Yes, the short-term stuff. I'm very reluctant to dash in on some of these things. I've started a few businesses. It's always a mistake to try and spend money too quickly because you don't quite know how it's working. But if you were asking me where I would specifically spend some money, I would start to spend that money on groups of people, existing researchers, connecting them up, having seminars and workshops, starting to fund little bits of research, opening up some competitions, getting some ideas for where these standards might be, putting oil in a mechanism that is seized up, has become somewhat rusty. And I would go around looking for where I can, with relatively little money, and we are talking about nothing like Eva's amounts that you need to spend on a fab plant. With relatively little amounts of money, I think you could free up a lot of stuff. But you need to put in, at the same time, quite a lot of investment in monitoring all of that, so that you are learning from that process. There are a lot of brilliant engineers. There are a lot of brilliant people in the United Kingdom. And my impression is that we don't do enough to connect those up. And so my first action will be to use the catapults, to use the academies, to use our brilliant universities, to use fabulous corporations. And honestly, we have some, as we've already heard, some marvelous stuff going on in telecoms manufacture. Start to bring those people together. That actually costs money. It costs money to service. It costs money to actually make it work. And that's where I would start. And I would have a framework for that, so that it wasn't just a nice party, as good as that is, just a talking shop. No, there was a framework about what kind of information we were going to get out of that, A bit like I suppose, a distributed catapult would be one way of thinking about it.
I absolutely agree with what David's just said. I'd also like to suggest one specific area where some intervention could be very timely, especially in respect of the fact that there are a lot of antenna engineers who were made redundant just before Christmas when a company called Axel Wireless went into administration. And I think antennas haven't actually been mentioned, but Huawei holds an awful lot of IP in antennas, and that is going to be a weakness going forward. We have in the past had some significant antenna capability in this country, most of which got bought up by Cobham, who have now said they have absolutely no interest in telecoms at all. And it was because they sold Axel Wireless that it's now gone into administration. So, I mean, that is a specific case, but just one example, I think, of an area where it isn't too late to reverse a particular trend.
Mike.
I completely support David's comments and Helen's comments.
Okay, thanks. We've got just about 11 minutes left. I want to just go to Kevin Jones, who I think had a question that was prompted from something that I replied to the Minister, and then I'll try and go back to Chi and back to the Minister before we finish. Kevin.
Okay, just a quick one really is, we're talking here a lot about government and what government can do, which is fine. But in terms of attracting sufficient private sector investment in some of these emerging technologies, how are you going to kickstart that? Because that's going to be the acid test in terms of growing some of these companies.
Well, sorry, Alan. No, after you, please.
I think hardware technology has a very poor image with investors, and I think we could probably take an initiative to try and improve that, including amongst trying to attract the right people to take on careers in hardware rather than software, as it's seemingly not becoming so glamorous, but it underpins the whole thing.
So if I could, Helen, I think you're right about. Of course, it's very interesting these days that if you want to get investment in a company, as I have personal experience of this, you present it as a software company that needs a little bit of hardware to make the software work. You don't say at all that it's a hardware company. So that's one thing to note. But I think more seriously on the general point about private investment and interest in these things, this is a matter of setting up the rules of the game so that it makes sense for the private investors and the private people to get involved. I mean, none of this is achieved by government. None of it is entirely achieved, indeed, by the private sector. This is one of these areas, one of these issues, I think, where you need to think about how government sets the rules up and sets the incentive structure so that the private sector explores the environment, because government can't work out exactly how this is going to turn out. The private sector can then explore it, which is why, for example, procurement is so important. If you can procure and from a number of different sources and encourage people to move forward, you will explore the possibilities of innovation much more rapidly than any single company can do or any single government. So we need to construct the rules of the game so that the private sector can start to deliver what the private sector is really good at. And I think that I said about oil in the wheels. I'm now talking about really unblocking drains at this point. I think we really need to make sure that the mechanism is working properly.
And I would support that. And I would just add that, some of the mechanisms that we could explore are things like these competitions, where government puts in a certain amount, private industry puts in a matching amount. but it's got to be significant, and it's got to be a large investment. You know, something that make a difference, something that will help the you know, take it from the early innovation stage through to you know, a full-scale manufacture in the UK.
When you say it's got to be significant and large, do you want to put a figure on it?
It's yeah, that's a bit. I walked into that one, didn't I? Well, I just come back to my point though, and I think my earlier point was that it's really great that the bill is, you know, proposing £250 million of money for R&D over 5 years. But actually, you know, if that turns out to be £50 million a year, and then you just think about BT, who are spending £500 million a year just on their network, then the 50 really isn't very much, is it? It's appreciated, it's really appreciated, but it's not not a significant amount in the context of that.
Yeah. Okay, thank you for that. Chi.
Thank you very much. Helen, you were absolutely right to emphasise that in terms of how we got here with no UK telecommunications network capability, it was also, as well as underinvestment, which I said, it was also about acquisitions, mergers, but mainly acquisitions of UK capability and capacity. And we do have the National Security and Investment Bill going through, in fact, coming back for its report stage tomorrow, which will actually make national security a grounds of intervening in acquisitions and investments, though not, if you like, economic security. But I wonder, it won't make investment in companies any easier, and so I wondered what, you know, we're talking about sort of concrete measures. What measures could government take or could be taken to make additional investment, significant additional investment available or easier?
That's an interesting question.
Telecoms Business Bank.
Yeah, I think if you can't stop mergers and acquisitions happening, but I think if you can put some sort of criteria on it that that companies who buy British companies need to give a commitment to continue to invest in this country for a set period of time, for instance, whether or not that is practical, would help. But the most important thing, I think, is to make the companies themselves strong enough so that they are not targets for asset stripping, as has happened in the past. So all the measures that we're talking about to oil the wheels, as David says, will be making our companies stronger and able to compete in what is still a global market. I think making our companies competitive is the key to this.
Can I just say there was a thing called the Macmillan Gap, which it led to the emergence of the Industrial Finance Corporation, the ICFC, in the late 1940s. And that gap was this gap, if you translate it into modern terms, investments required of around about £500,000 to £5 million or £10 million. And we're still living with that. And that gap was identified in the 1920s. We have a structural problem in the United Kingdom about the way in which we invest in some of these, what would otherwise in Germany be called Mittelstand, those smaller companies. And I think, Chi, you're quite right to draw attention to that as a particular risk profile. People do not want to put money necessarily past the seed stage into what I would call late Series A, really, or Series A and into Series B. The other one is procurement. Going back, I've mentioned it before, but if you have customers, if you have a client or two who is prepared to buy kit from you, you not only get money, you not only, but you get experience and you get expertise, you develop your company. And we need more incentives for procuring from those kind of middle area companies, because out of those will come the giants of tomorrow. And my experience in Cambridge and elsewhere is that quite often many of those companies, they say they're entirely private sector driven. Actually, they have been the subject of lots of government procurement and lots of government interventions along the way. And that's particularly true in the United States, where the SBIR scheme is very, very important.
Do you have anything you want to add to that?
I don't have anything to add to that. I support.
I'm just going to go back to the Minister T because I'm conscious of time.
Thank you. It's a very simple question in some ways, and it follows up on what a lot of David has been saying. Obviously, when we've talked about £250 million, that's to work with the private sector. Where we've run testbeds and trials programmes, we've talked about match funding. What sort do you presumably you would think that is a sensible approach, but to take forward, but also I wonder what you think the limits or what a reasonable proportion of government spending, government investment in a company might look like, rather than simply the traditional match funding model. And I know that this is sort of how long is a piece of string, but in terms of stakes and all that sort of thing, there's obviously a spectrum, isn't there?
Yeah, well, Minister, my instinct is not for the government not to take stakes in companies. I think that is beginning a distortion of
the phrase, but you get the gist. Yeah.
Yeah, I think the primary way to do it. Firstly, let's set the rules and regulations. Number two, let's put some pump priming into the networks to allow people to talk. Number three, let's see if we can get the procurement sorted out so that these companies can actually get the lifeblood pumping through them. And then number four, if you really do need to, because of security or other strategic interests, are there things like the British Business Bank or other mechanisms which are intermediaries between government? You don't want government directly intervening in this stuff that can help. And that's the hierarchy in which you deal with this. Now, exactly how that works in the particular case, I haven't spent enough time to give a detailed response.
Okay, order. I'm afraid we've run out of time. I know we could have gone a bit longer there, but thank you to our witnesses. Thank you very much indeed. And that concludes that session and brings us to the final session of the day. Are people quite happy to proceed? Yep. Okay. Right. So we're now going to hear from Doug Brake, who's the Director of Broadband and Spectrum Policy at the Information Technology and Innovation Foundation. And we have until 4 o'clock for this session. Good afternoon, Mr. Brake. Could I just ask you to introduce yourself for the record, please?
Yes, thank you very much. As you mentioned, my name is Doug Brake. I'm the Director of Broadband and Spectrum Policy for the Information Technology and Innovation Foundation. We're a think tank based in Washington, D.C., focused on policies that we believe advance innovation, with the basic belief that innovation is the key tool to economic growth and human flourishing over the long term.
Thank you. Okay, who wants to have Sarah Brickcliffe?
Hi, just a quick question, and I've asked this previously to other witnesses. What is it that you support in this bill?
Sure, yeah. From at a very high level, I would say cybersecurity generally, the goal of government intervention should be to make it easy, cheap, and desirable for the private sector to do cybersecurity well. So I have some vague concerns that there are some increased costs that may come from the Telecommunications Security Bill, just the compliance costs, but otherwise identifying this is a serious issue that needs to be looked at, giving Ofcom the tools that it needs to investigate security challenges, especially with regards to the equipment, and working with the private sector to mitigate those risks is a big step forward. On the diversification strategy, I think it's a very wise document, and that, to my mind, is one of the best opportunities we have to mitigate long-term risks, particularly with high-risk vendors in the area. So I think the diversification strategy is quite wise and would make the UK a real leader in this space in terms of policy.
James Wilde. Thanks very much, Chairman. What's your view of the implications of the Biden administration for American potential involvement in the diversification strategy in telecoms more broadly?
It's a good question. There are a lot of people asking that question, trying to figure out exactly where this will go. I think that at a high level, where we've kind of passed the Rubicon, right, in the confrontation with Huawei and China over some of these innovation mercantilist policies that we've seen that has undermined the global innovation in wireless equipment. And I don't think that that's going to change at a high level, right? No politician in Washington, in the US, wants to be seen as soft on China. I think there will continue to be policies that attempt to roll back some of the innovation mercantilism we've seen in wireless equipment space. That said, I expect and hope that it will be done with a more measured and coordinated effort with like-minded allies such as the UK, and sort of less scattershot policies across the US government. What we've seen over the last several years in the United States is a variety of different agencies sort of doing what they can to mitigate these risks. So less a coordinated whole of government approach in the US, and more a disjointed and fragmented policy response across different agencies. So I'm hopeful that under a Biden administration, we see a much more coordinated effort and one that is more cooperative with allies.
Thank you. Kevin Jones.
Just in terms of that cooperation between nations, because clearly it's not just been the UK's response to the threat from Huawei. We were forced to go down our present track by the American sanctions against China in terms of semiconductors. How do you see going forward that cooperation developing, and how do we prevent a situation whereby, with its scale and obviously resources, the United States would dominate any future standards, but also technology areas where they might talk about cooperation, which they do in a lot of areas, but when it comes down to brass tacks, it's America first in terms of business. And that's not a Trump.
It's a good question. So to take the first part of your question with regards to the export controls that the administration put in place in an aim to try to kneecap Huawei, I think is fair to say. First of all, from our perspective, those were not very well thought through strategy, right? Without coordination, without a broad coalition to address those sorts of trade practices, in effect, the U.S., we really only shot our own selves in the foot, right? Undermined any of the technology companies, equipment providers that were attempting to sell components and chips to Huawei. So, to my mind, if you're not going to succeed in killing Huawei, that's not a very effective strategy. It simply undermines your own industry. I'm hopeful and expectant that we see a change in that policy going forward. That said, if there was a desire from a broader coalition internationally to take on similar sorts of efforts, something like a NATO for trade, to address these unfair practices, then that could be a very effective strategy if it was done with a broader coalition. To your second question, the sort of long-term goal of diversification of the radio access network supply chain, the goal is to allow for a much more diverse and modular system in which any number of companies could compete within different niche areas of the market, right? So There are admittedly some areas of that sort of high performance generic server infrastructure, as well as software that the U.S. does quite well. But I think opening up this the supply chain would allow for a number of companies internationally to compete quite strongly. And I think that there's a question of to what extent countries are willing to aggressively pursue an industrial strategy to support this sort of change that could give potential comparative advantage to different countries in pursuing this sort of transformational change to the telecommunications supply chain.
In terms of the ban on semiconductors, obviously that's worth a lot to the US in terms of exports to mainly China. Do you see that changing? And also, do you think there's a danger that, not in the short term obviously, but in the longer term, China will then create a separate semiconductor market which could be a threat not just to the US but others, in terms of they'll buy into markets and try and get standards that are different to the US?
I think that's absolutely right. That there's a real risk of, if we cut off supply to China, particularly semiconductors, we've already seen aggressive actions on their part to stand up an indigenous semiconductor industry. This is getting a little outside of my area of expertise. Semiconductors is not someplace I know super well, but I think that's absolutely correct. That there's a real risk to the extent we try to cut off Chinese companies that they'll double down efforts to create their own indigenous supply chain. So absolutely, I am hopeful that we see either a change to that or a much broader international coalition to double down on those efforts. I think more likely is we'll see a Biden administration ease some of those restrictions or work through the current legal means to allow for licenses to companies to sell semiconductors to Huawei and others.
Thank you. Dean Russell.
Thank you, Chair. During my previous career, many years ago, I was a physics researcher and was very fortunate to work at places like the Advanced Photon Source synchrotron in Argonne, Illinois, and worked extensively in the semiconductor space, looking at the time at materials such as gallium nitride and other group 3 nitrides. And what I learned back then, working very extensively with American scientists and scientists from around the world, was the importance of that root and branch look at semiconductors, at innovation, and having a decades-long view. And I was just interested from your perspective how much that fits in with a joined-up international approach to create diversity, both at the end stage but also at the really early research stage.
I think that's absolutely right. That this is a long-term effort, right? I worry about some who tout ORAN as something of a silver bullet that we can make a quick transition to a sort of flash cut from existing equipment providers to an open RAN sort of system, a more modular and diverse ecosystem. It's something that's going to take a number of years. I do honestly worry that it is late for ORAN to be incorporated into 5G, at least on a broad scale. For greenfield networks, it's a different story. That might make sense to go with these open and modular systems from the get-go. But I do worry that this is a much more conversation about putting in the tools, resources, the testing facilities, the labs, R&D, et cetera, to put us on a path for years down the road that this becomes the industry standard. So I do think absolutely that this is the time to be looking at those early stage investments, to be driving, really looking down the road, frankly, to 6G, to be able to put in place the policies and efforts to transition the industry to this more diverse future. Put those in place now for years to come.
Thank you.
James Sunderland.
Thanks for coming in. Quick question. Can you please put in layman's terms what the rollout of 5G anywhere means in broadband terms? And can you also place that in terms of rural areas?
Sure. So 5G, right? I worry sometimes 5G is conceptualized as sort of a singular technology or a singular thing. It's not a monolith. There are a number of different component technologies and a number of different flavors, depending on whether or not you're doing a fully 5G network, a standalone network, or a non-standalone network. It's a very different sort of system. There's also a lot of differences between what spectrum is used to deploy the network. If you're using low band, mid band, or high band spectrum, or a combination of all three. And so it's hard to answer that question in generalities, right? There are a number of different component technologies, number of different architectures that will be rolled out over time. At a high level, right, the real advantage to 5G compared to 4G is in its flexibility. It's able to tailor its connectivity to a number of different applications needs. It can offer extremely high throughput, much faster speeds, very reliable, with very low latency. So for example, if you want to stream a football match while you're traveling on the train, it can do that quite well, quite a bit better than LTE and 4G today. Though at the same time, you can also change very obscure technical parameters to make for very, very simple communications that require very little battery on the device side and able to communicate. So if you want to have massive deployments of sensors for smart agriculture or something like that have battery life on the order of decades, it can do that. And so really the hallmark is its flexibility. Given that flexibility, it's anticipated that 5G is going to be much more deeply integrated within the economy, within traded sectors, and will be a key tool to boost productivity. So there's an important hope that we see a broad deployment, right? Not just in urban areas, but also in rural areas. Again, I go back to that note on differences depending on the spectrum that's used to deploy. Unless it's of interest, I don't want to get too bogged down in the details, but there are real differences in what we would expect to see deployed in urban versus rural areas. But again, we would also expect to see very different use cases in those areas. And so, admittedly, there's going to likely be a performance difference between urban areas and more rural areas. But at the same time, like I said, the use cases are very different. And so, you're not likely to have massive crowds of people all looking to share video from a stadium or something like that in rural areas. And so there's going to be a real difference in rollout, but I worry that sometimes the challenges with that have been overstated.
Thanks. Chair.
Thank you very much, and thank you very much, Doug, for joining us. And it's particularly interesting to have your American perspective. And as you may have heard, my first job as a hardware engineer was with Nortel, a Canadian-American company which had just bought one of the last UK companies in this area. And Nortel itself ended up seeking Chapter 11 and having most of its IP bought by Huawei. So I wonder, what your views are on how we got ourselves into this position of not having a single UK or US supplier who can supply to our UK networks, and how you think we can work together to rebuild our telecom sectors. And particularly, you talked about pursuing transformational change in an industrial strategy to do that. And what might you say to the minister that how the UK government should be working with the US, or what sort of vehicles there might be to work together and with other allies to achieve that?
Absolutely, it's a great question. I mean, we talk now about needing diversification, seeking entry of a US-UK equipment supplier, but the sort of question and the lessons from history of why we need this in the first place, when in the past we had quite successful, especially Lucent in the US, quite successful telecommunications supply companies. the president of our organization, Rob Atkinson, set out to answer this very question. You may have seen an article in Journal of American Affairs titled "Who Lost Lucent?" So it's a long, interesting article. If there's interest, I won't go into all of the details of history, but there certainly is. I would say. I think it's fair to characterize the failures, the decline of Lucent, right? It's a complicated story, but stemmed from a combination of unique challenges imposed by Anglo-American economic system, systemic failures of U.S. government policy, particularly with regard to antitrust and some of the regulatory policy through the 90s, and strong, particularly in regards to China, right? Strong and aggressive foreign industrial policies to acquire market share. So I'm happy to go through in some detail, but I don't know, feel free to cut me off if I go on too long, but you're absolutely right. We had Lucent and Nortel. Lucent was absolutely massive. It was 3 times larger than Nortel, and originally spun off of AT&T's equipment arm, Western Electric, and had the famed Bell Labs. Through the 90s, it was the largest telecom equipment company. Was still growing dramatically overseas, but due to a number of sort of strategic decisions within the company and also decisions within the U.S. government, it ended up really suffering as a result of the dot-com bubble. So setting aside all the sort of competitiveness questions, particularly with regard to Chinese companies, for now, right? We saw through the 90s the sort of hands-off free market globalized system that reigned in the US and the UK, really finance-focused capitalism that saw Lucent and Nortel both really cut their R&D budgets and cut staff dramatically, particularly as a result of the 2001 crash, much more so than some of their international competitors. With a sort of financial system, it was harder for these companies that were designed to be sort of growth companies, much more so than a value company, right? They were focused on growing quarter after quarter, meeting their financial targets, which made it very difficult to focus on long-term growth. You can contrast with that with Ericsson in Sweden, where the Wallenberg family, who controls a lot of the voting shares for Ericsson, were able to focus on much longer term value creation, and they did not cut staff or R&D by nearly as much as Lucent. Even back before that, I think that there's a lot of lessons to be learned from the aggressive antitrust action that broke up Bell Labs and sort of restructured the entire industry. Up until restructuring of the U.S. telecom market in 1984, Bell Labs had really a fantastic situation in order to generate innovation. They had the commercial drive and focus, flexibility that you often lack in a government research lab, but it also had the long-term focus, interest in broad technological change that many R&D efforts in industry don't see. It had steady revenue from telecom rates. And so, I mean, there's a complicated story there. It's hard to tell where concentration is good for innovation and where competition is really the order of the day. But it seems clear that the decline of Bell Labs was a real loss.
Maybe you could,
for the sake of time, yeah.
Maybe you could contribute your, I think the article you mentioned as written evidence, and that summary, as well as the key points you made. Yeah. And look forward to how we can work. The second part of my question about how we can work together.
Absolutely, I think the diversification strategy is a very strong document. I would say when it comes to Open RAN generally, there are obviously clear benefits, right? That you all have, I'm sure, heard a lot about. Diversification, faster innovation when software is decoupled from hardware, generally lower margins on this on generic components kind of eliminates the risk of the entire sector tipping to a single vendor or gradual narrowing of trusted suppliers. But there are real challenges with this process, and so again, I go back to this is going to be a gradual effort. That there's not a need to transition immediately, right? First of all, there's real risk of bandwagoning, right? That this is seen as a silver bullet. That there's even companies that might not be interested in pursuing this area, right? The incumbents, Nokia and Ericsson, are willing to join in these efforts if it's even just for sake of defense. So where there's real risk of bandwagoning, there's real complexity with transitioning to this sort of system. It's not immediately clear how well Open RAN will scale, right? Actual implementation at scale in urban areas. It's adding a tremendous amount of complexity, a much larger attack surface, right? It's worth keeping in mind. SolarWinds, right, was a U.S. company trusted by many within the government that saw this massive damaging breach. I think there's a real challenge that remains to be addressed in the manufacturing of standalone radios. I think that's a potential opportunity for real cooperation, is identifying companies that are interested in focusing purely on the radio, right? There's still hardware that needs to be provided that historically was integrated with the broader system. When you only have relatively small providers that are interested in scaling up manufacturing, that can be a difficult challenge.
Interrupt you there. Just I'm sorry, but I'm conscious of time, and I want to give the Minister a fair opportunity. Minister.
Thank you, and thank you for that interesting evidence. It sort of follows on from Chi's question in a sense. I think it goes without saying that we'll be very keen to work with America in the future, and I think